Now, Ralph Ashton convened the international group, the Terrestrial Carbon Group, in 2007, while leader of the climate change program at the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists in Sydney. During 2008, I was very pleased that he was a visiting fellow at my Centre on Climate and Energy at CARMA in the Australian National University, and he'll shortly become Program Director at the Terrestrial Carbon Group at the Heinz Centre in Washington, DC, and in 2009 will be a visiting scholar in the Centre for Environment, Economy and Society at Columbia University. Ralph has wide experience ranging from coordinating WWF's global response to the Indian Ocean earthquakes and tsunami, to providing advice on mergers, acquisitions and takeovers, first as a lawyer and then as an investment banker. He's also the editor and a contributor to Tarkeen, a photographic book published in 2004 to raise awareness on the pride of this unique Tasmanian rainforest wilderness, and worked on WWF's forestry policy development for Tasmania. Now, first, it's useful to define what we mean by terrestrial carbon, because I realise that many people in this room may not be completely understanding of the term. The definition we use is terrestrial carbon is carbon that's locked in landscapes, such as forests, soils and other matter. In the debate to responding to climate change risks, there's been a great deal of focus on mitigation, but particularly on changing energy systems, but there's been too little focus, in my view, on how we adapt to climate change and how do we tap into the enormous potential offered by the terrestrial carbon on the planet. And this imbalance in the debate is reflected in the form of the Kyoto Protocol, as well as in the current global policy frameworks that are being negotiated as we speak.
Thank you, Warwick, and thank you everyone for coming. So, sort of climate change basics, I'll just start there, and this might seem obvious, and to some of you it probably is obvious, but it gets forgotten because in the climate change debate the sort of details tend to take over. But it's pretty simple. Climate change is caused by the build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They've only got two other places to go. It's the oceans and the terrestrial system. And as Warwick defined it, that terrestrial system is soils, forests, peat. Again, the simple numbers are that while currently around about 20% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions globally come from deforestation, about 25% of the solution can come from the terrestrial system when you add in the possibility of both stopping emissions going from the terrestrial system into the atmosphere and growing new terrestrial carbon in the terrestrial system. So when you grow a new tree, you're essentially sucking carbon or greenhouse gases back from the atmosphere into the terrestrial system, and that helps with climate change mitigation. So this system, or the terrestrial, the landscapes, offer globally 25% of the climate change solution. But in the developing world, which is where most of that 25% is attainable, they're excluded from the international response to climate change. And that then brings us really to the Terrestrial Carbon Group and what we're about. And as Warwick said, what we have set out to do is put forward a method to bring that 25% of the climate change solution back into the international agreements on climate change. And I'll just tell you a little bit about some of these people. The idea was to bring together an international, interdisciplinary team who understood both the regional dynamics and the science and the economics of climate change, land use decisions, carbon markets. So apart from the three members who are in the room today, Peter Cozier, Warwick McKibbin and myself, that's the list of names. And I would just point out, for instance, that Rizaldi Boer there, the third person, is probably the most eminent scientist and person who understands the methodologies of land-based emissions in Indonesia. Ruth de Vries is a MacArthur Genius Award winner on satellite and remote sensing, so the ability to look down on forest cover, and also not just forest cover but biomass within the forests and landscapes, and determine what's happening. Mohammed Al-Ashri used to run the Global Environment Fund, and then you have Thomas Lovejoy, who invented the term biodiversity. You have Jacques Markovic, who is essentially the Brazilian Nicholas Stern. He's doing the economics of climate change for Brazil. And then Hadi Sasastro is one of the most respected public policy figures in Indonesia. And of course, Joseph Stiglitz with a Nobel Prize in economics. So you have a very high caliber group of people who came together to put their expertise and experience of solving problems into a document. And I guess why was there a need for this? There are something like 35 different proposals from countries, NGOs, think tanks on how to solve this particular problem or part of this problem. The reason we thought it was necessary was that most of those proposals are full of shoulds, not hows. And we wanted to put forward a document, which we've done, and there are copies of it at the front, of how do you bring the 25% in, not just you should, you should, you should. So what are the limitations of the international response to climate change? I guess we can kind of think that everything's under control because Australia's ratified Kyoto. Kyoto's in force. We're going to have a new agreement apparently in Copenhagen, so why worry? We think there are four. First is that when we talk about terrestrial carbon or forests in the international response to climate change at the moment, the focus is very much on forests. But if we have a look at this chart, the two green bits are the mitigation potential. So this is the climate change solution that could be provided by forests is this green bit, and in the orange is agriculture. So that's really the terrestrial system. And this is coming from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change numbers. And then when you move from the global across to the developing countries, it's obviously slightly smaller, and the pie changes shape a little bit. But the main point is that in the Kyoto Protocol, the light green part, the forest sequestration, where we're growing new forests and sucking carbon back down, is meant to be included in the Kyoto Protocol. There's a thing called the Clean Development Mechanism, and it should provide a way to provide incentives to people who are growing new carbon through afforestation and reforestation, using the defined terms there, to do that. Unfortunately, it's so complicated and so bureaucratic and difficult that only one project in the whole world has been certified to do that. So that huge chunk of light green there of the terrestrial carbon solution hasn't been, even though it's in the Kyoto Protocol, it's been completely ineffective. When you get to the dark green area, which is avoiding deforestation, that's been out of the Kyoto Protocol. So it hasn't even been part of the international solution. There's been a debate for 2 years now, or over 2 years, to bring that back in, avoided deforestation. So where you were going to chop down a forest and release that carbon, to not do that and be paid an incentive to keep the carbon in the trees. So there's been lots of discussion for 2.5 years to bring that in, and in Bali last year it was agreed that it would be brought into the international system. But still we're leaving the orange, which is agriculture, and the light green is not really the focus of this red. It's called reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, from that debate. So if you look at the potential of the terrestrial system, this is 25% of the climate change solution, and the current negotiations are really only focused on this bit here. You can see we're missing a huge opportunity. So that's why we think we need to broaden it out beyond forests. Second is this, the system as it's evolved from the Rio Conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol, and then into the Montreal COP in 2005, when avoided deforestation was, that dark green box was brought back into the negotiations, to now. It's a big mess of defined terms, of exceptions, voluntary markets, compliance markets. You have this clean development mechanism. You have terms like afforestation and reforestation, and you wonder why there are differences between the two. Forest degradation, people suddenly realise that actually forest degradation causes a lot of emissions. Then people realise that peatlands and the emissions from peatlands are important. So people tried to define their way to change red into red with just one D about deforestation, into red with two Ds about deforestation and forest degradation, and then trying to sort of make that definition malleable so that it would include peatlands, because in countries like Indonesia, peatlands are very important for emissions. And so we have this kind of defined to death system where it's a big mess, and actually if you just stood back and said, what are we trying to do? We're trying to unlock 25% of the climate change solution. You could have a much simpler agreement and way of thinking about the terrestrial system. There are obviously political reasons why it has developed in this way, but if we're serious about avoiding dangerous climate change, we have to be serious about unlocking that 25% that terrestrial carbon offers. The third is that a lot of the discussion focuses on reducing rates rather than avoiding emissions. And I guess this is maybe a pedantic mathematical or theoretical point, but what we look at in this chart is that if you think about that 100% there is how much carbon is locked up in the terrestrial system today, and it can come down to zero. And so the orange line is just assuming there's a business as usual deforestation rate, and as the forests get chopped down, the carbon in those forests gets released, and you end up coming down, let's say, at 40%, and then you might flatten out because you work out that actually you need some forests for watershed protection and other reasons. But we're still losing 60% of the carbon locked up in our forests. If all we do is provide an incentive to change that rate, to move that orange line across to the dotted white line, which is slowing the rate of emissions or slowing the rate of deforestation, it kind of looks good in this intermediate period because there's a difference between the two lines. So you can say, well, we've had less carbon emissions from the terrestrial system. But if you draw it out over a climate change relevant period, and climate change is not going to be solved in 5 years, it's going to take us a long time, then you see that here we got to kind of 40% cover of forests and we lost 60% at this year. If we've just slowed the emissions down, we get to the same point a number of years later. So we've had the same climate change impact, which is all that carbon going into the atmosphere. We've just paid a whole lot of money to delay it. What we need to do instead is have a system which moves this orange or white dotted line up, so you have fewer emissions from the terrestrial system. And the fourth and last point about what we believe is a limitation of the international response is that there's a very dynamic system between population, and we know population is increasing by something like 45% between now and 2050, from 6.9 to 9.2 billion people or thereabouts. Demand for food, fibre, fuel, carbon now that we want to store carbon in the landscape, and land. And all the demand for all of that is driven in part by population, in part by living standard increases. Prices for those commodities based on available land and competing demands for other products from that land, and then land use decisions, which feeds back into population. So if we take a limited snapshot, we get the wrong picture. We need to be thinking about what is the real dynamic that's driving land use change and therefore terrestrial carbon emissions and sequestration potential over this longer term period. And I think one good example is where you've had land use changes in New Zealand, say, going back from agricultural into forest-based land use, and then with China's boom and living standard increases there and demand for meat products and dairy products, farmers have changed their minds again and gone back into livestock production and dairy production. So you can see this dynamic moving. So what's the solution? That's kind of the opportunity, the 25% of climate change, the limitations that we see with the current negotiations and the international system on climate change. We wanted to go further than that. So in this document, we've put forward guiding principles for any solution on bringing that 25% in to the climate change regime. And then we've gone one step further and we've basically provided the skeleton of the regulatory regime that would be agreed at an international level to allow that to happen. So quickly going through the 9 guiding principles, and they all link back to what we've talked about already. The first is that it's about maximising the long-term terrestrial carbon volumes. It's not about immediate or short-term rates of deforestation changes. It's about keeping terrestrial carbon in the terrestrial system, not letting it go into the atmosphere, and sucking atmospheric carbon or greenhouse gases back into the terrestrial system. That's the role that the terrestrial or landscapes can play in climate change mitigation. And so that links to the second point, which is that it's about both keeping what's there, so slowing down deforestation or avoiding deforestation, and growing new trees or new terrestrial carbon, whether it's trees or shrubs or grass or other ways of capturing it in the terrestrial system. The third is, as we pointed out in the first point, is that we need to include all types of terrestrial carbon. It's not, just including forests, just including avoided deforestation is a step in the right direction, but you're missing out on a large proportion of that solution that terrestrial carbon can give. So let's have a full accounting system for the terrestrial carbon, which is effectively what Annex 1 or industrialised countries can do. through what's called LULUCF rules, land use, change and forestry, which has been changed to AFLU, or as in the IPCC has been changed to AFLU, the agriculture, forest and other land use. So it's another example of these definitions. There's a big debate, which we think is one of these false binaries, where people are thinking they have to choose between two things and only choose one of them, between whether an incentive for changed land use practices, which would unlock this 25%, should come from a market mechanism or should come from a fund which would be subscribed to by countries or intergovernmental organisations. So they're setting these things up in opposition to each other, or whether it should be a public or a government thing or a private sector driven thing. This problem is huge. We've been trying to deal with forests and forest policy and land use policy and sustainable land use planning for a long time as a world, and it's not going to go away quickly. There's no need to have a fight between all the different ways that we can provide the incentives. So the point here is that we can use a mix of complementary approaches. The fifth point is that while terrestrial carbon is an essential part of the climate change solution, offering 25% of that solution, it doesn't offer the other 75%. So if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change, we still have to take action in our other emitting sectors, so in industry, transport, etc. Sixth point, that land use decisions are made at a national or subnational level. There is no international agreement or government who can tell countries what to do, so any system to be effective has to recognise where sovereignty lies and provide the incentives to the right level. And that might mean that in one country with one constitutional framework, you need to do one type of system where it could be managed at a national level and implemented at a national level. And in another country with another constitutional arrangement where you have much more devolved power, you might have to have a national framework but allow for subnational activities. And we don't really get into that question in our document. We say that that's something for each country to work out how to best do it. We would need to build appropriate national and international institutions. And one analogy, maybe not a very timely analogy at the moment, but is the system that's built up around the international economic system with its not necessarily binding institutions, but institutions for coordination, verification and certification and standard setting. So you could have that at an international, intergovernmental level, and again allow nations to work out what the best way is for them to implement a system that meets those criteria or standards. Eighth is avoid perverse outcomes. So let's not make timber extraction, for instance, so difficult that construction moves into concrete or steel and the embedded CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions in concrete and steel are higher than in timber. So kind of taking this sort of bigger picture, longer term view on the climate change solution and the role of terrestrial carbon in that. And then the ninth point is very important. There's been a lot of discussion ever since Kyoto and before of, well, we don't know enough. The science isn't good enough. It's too uncertain. We're not sure about this forest stuff, soil, biomass, above ground, below ground. We don't know what really happens to it, whether the measurement and monitoring systems are good enough. Our group, and I take you back to the second slide where we'll list who the group are and their backgrounds, says we do know enough, we can get started, we know it's not perfect, but let's start and adapt over time as we get new information, as we work out how the system is building. So that's the principles, and I think I only have 2 slides left, fine? So based on those principles, again, we thought that lots of different think tanks and NGOs had kind of almost got to that level of principles, although maybe in a different way and with some different details. But then they left a lot of questions open of, well, how do we know that what we're proposing to reward in terms of land use management decisions wouldn't have happened anyway? So there's a question of additionality which gets brought up in terrestrial carbon or RED or in other aspects of climate change as well. So is it additional to what would have happened anyway? What happens if you change a land use practice here, but people still want beef or soy or timber, and so the deforestation that was going to happen here moves over here, and that's known as leakage in this negotiation. And again, I'd point out that it's not just limited to the terrestrial system where leakage can happen, where you can have it in even stationary power generation. If production moves from one country to another, it might take longer than a forestry leakage, but it certainly can happen that, okay, we were producing a whole lot of things in this country, we stop the emissions there, and the things still get produced over here and the emissions still happen. So that leakage is not unique to forestry. The point is that most of the proposals just said, well, and we have to deal with leakage additionality and make sure that everything's permanent. And so there's a sort of list of unanswered questions. We wanted to go one step further and provide a system. And we don't say it's necessarily the best in the world or the only, but we say it's one way to do it that addresses all those difficult questions, is consistent with our 9 principles, and most importantly, gets you to a benefit for the atmosphere for a climate change solution. So, very simply, our system takes a country, so it's national level accounting of terrestrial carbon, we would say, and so this is represented here as the whole blue area is the country. Taken an inventory of the terrestrial carbon volume in that country at a particular date. So you'll get a volume. And I'll take you through a worked example of Indonesia, where our Indonesian colleagues have applied real data to our system to show you what sort of numbers come out. But there's how much carbon is in the landscape in a country. Then we're trying to break that into 2 categories. The first is the carbon that we expect over a climate change relevant period will be emitted into the atmosphere. So will contribute to climate change. And on the other hand, the volume of carbon in the terrestrial system, which is always going to be there because there's no risk of it being emitted into the atmosphere. That's at the heart of our system, what we do. And then we say, let's provide incentives to the bit which would be emitted to keep it there. We don't have to provide any new incentives to the bit which was never going to be emitted because it was never going to be emitted. But the bit that was going to be emitted, we need to provide a new way of looking at that. So we can talk about it as you used to be able to chop down your forest and grow soybeans or wheat or raise cattle or pull out timber. Now there's one more economic opportunity for you, which is carbon storage. So we're saying you can now choose between being a farmer of carbon and just keeping the carbon in the landscape or growing new carbon, or if economics or other reasons mean you want to chop that down and put in beef or soy or palm oil, then do that. And then it's up to the incentive system, if we're serious about avoiding dangerous climate change, to make sure that the price offered for carbon storage is high enough to compete with the other economic development potential for that land. So the way we do that is we say, and these circles, they're different sizes, but it's not meant to be indicative of size, but we say, so what's already effectively protected by law? So you've got national parks, you've got land use planning rules which say you can't chop down that forest, you can't convert that grassland into pasture, you can't drain that peat swamp. So effectively, and that effectively is an important word because in a lot of developing countries and in some of our own states in Australia, we have illegal activity. So we have legally protected, but we still have illegal activity which is not respecting that law. So that's the first bit. The second bit is protected by biophysical constraints, by which we mean is the forest or the terrestrial carbon on a very steep slope where you just wouldn't put in agriculture, or it's too wet, or it's too dry, or it faces the wrong way from the sun, so you wouldn't be able to, or it's got the wrong soil type. So you wouldn't ever expect that terrestrial carbon to be chopped down and burnt and converted into atmospheric carbon. And the third is that it's protected by economic constraints. This comes back to the dynamic links that we were talking about earlier of population, growth, demand for commodities, land use decisions and prices. So which areas are so far away, even thinking about 50 years out in economic development, so far from markets, from infrastructure, from possible infrastructure, from ports, that there'll never be an economic incentive to convert them to agricultural productive uses, basically. So they're the three orange dots, and that's what we're saying is protected. That's the stuff that's not at risk. You don't have to do anything more to incentivise that being there. But then all the rest, all the blue remaining, is what we call tradable. So we say, if you, instead of converting some of that tradable carbon to atmospheric carbon and to grow soy or beef or oil palm or timber, you agree to keep it there, then you can sell that volume of carbon as a carbon credit. Because what you've done is you've contributed that much carbon as carbon mitigation to the overall climate change solution. So that's your carbon storage service you're providing to the world, and you can sell that carbon storage service through a carbon credit.